and welcome to The Fog and the Fury with me, Sakina Hussain, and where we cut through the confusion and talk about the stuff that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Today, we're diving into a topic that's equal parts fascinating and frustrating, the messy middle where menopause meets ADHD. Both can bring forgetfulness, mood swings, and ever present brain fog. For so many women, the big question is it menopause? Is it ADHD? Or are we juggling with both at once? To help us make sense of it all, I'm joined by Professor Eleanor Dommett, a neuroscientist at King's College London, UK. Her work looks at ADHD across the lifespan, and she's especially interested in how hormonal shifts during menopause can affect things like attention, memory, and overall well being. What I love about her approach is how she makes neuroscience feel human by helping us understand how our brains and bodies are constantly shaping each other. Today, we're unpacking where the symptoms of menopause and ADHD overlap, where they differ, and how women can move through this stage with more clarity, confidence, and self compassion. All right, let's dive in, exploring the science, the real life stories, and what's next. Welcome, Dr. Dommett. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a really interesting topic we're going to talk about.
Amazing. So I'm going to shoot the first question right at you. In your research, you found that ADHD traits and menopausal complaints like memory lapses and mood changes and concentration difficulties often overlap. So, from a clinical or a lived experience perspective, what makes it so hard to tease apart whether these issues are driven by ADHD, menopause, or both?
So I think there's various factors at play here, and what we are seeing an increasing number of cases of is women being diagnosed with ADHD much later on in life. So when we look at the history of ADHD, we tend to be thinking, oh, it's something that happens in childhood, and we often associate it with little boys running around and being very hyperactive. And of course, we now know that ADHD affects both males and females, but we still see a bit of a lag in terms of when girls are diagnosed. So they will often be diagnosed later, and how effectively they're treated. So for some women, actually, everything really is happening at the same time. So perhaps they don't have a diagnosis of ADHD, but they're experiencing the menopause transition, which can be a very long period of time. And some of the symptoms they're experiencing with that will look very similar to the kind of symptoms they may experience if they have ADHD. So if there is no diagnosis in place, I think it's particularly tricky to pull these things apart. Obviously, if you have a prior diagnosis of ADHD, then you'll still get this overlapping symptoms. You know, difficulties in concentration are a hallmark of ADHD in many ways, but they're also a hallmark of the menopause. And so it's quite possible that you might even experience the menopause or those symptoms of the menopause transition in a way that feels less obvious to you because you've already attributed them to having ADHD. And so, what our research showed was that there was often quite a strong correlation between ADHD traits and common menopausal complaints, and in particular, the ones around concentration and attention, so the kind of brain fog idea, but also some of them around general well-being and psychosocial relationships, so interacting with others. The ones where we didn't see any particular interaction, and I think this is really important, is the vasomotor symptoms or the classic menopausal symptoms that we hear about in the media, the hot flushes and the night sweats. So they very much are not associated with ADHD, but many of the psychological ones and some of the physical complaints as well, aches and pains, sleep disruption, they can be associated with ADHD as well. So it is really difficult to differentiate between them. And I guess, so what we've shown is that there is this overlap. And now we need to unpick a little bit more the lived experience of it. So that initial research showing the overlap, we are shortly about to start a series of interviews, which is where the real lived experience can come into the research, where we ask women with ADHD, so with a confirmed diagnosis of the condition from a psychiatrist, if they how they are experiencing that menopause transition period. Because one possible hypothesis is that certain symptoms which they have, um, you know, probably spent most of their life with, as certainly from adolescence onwards, are not being equated to the menopause because they're being equated to ADHD, and others it's the other way round. So that's the next stage of our research, is to have a look at how women attribute the different experiences that they might have as part of either condition. I think clinically we're in a very interesting position in terms of treatments, because we know that hormonal fluctuations impact how well psychostimulants, which is the main treatment for ADHD, how well they work. So this isn't just during the menopause transition. We know that there can be a period immediately before menstruation when altered estrogen levels reduce the effectiveness of psychostimulant treatment for some women. So it can be really hard to tell, because there's this sort of mixture of fluctuating hormones impacting the medication that you've always possibly used effectively to treat your ADHD, merging with menopausal complaints as well. So it's a really muddy area, actually, and one which I think we're a long way off fixing, but or understanding fully. But I think what we're now at least doing is starting the conversation, which is so important.
Absolutely, and that's what we're here to address. It's as you said, it's a muddy area, and there's not much of information out there. Speaking of which, estrogen influences dopamine and other brain systems that are already implicated in ADHD. How do these hormonal changes during perimenopause and menopause specifically affect women with ADHD differently as opposed to with women without ADHD?
So we don't know exactly what's going on, but what we do know is that when you are perimenopausal, irrespective of whether you have ADHD, the fluctuations in estrogen levels that women will have experienced from their very first period all the way throughout life until menopause, those fluctuations, you can think of them as a sort of wave as you go across the month,
Mhm.
but a relatively shallow wave. So, although, of course, we know that fluctuations in estrogen associated with menstruation can be quite challenging for girls and for women. In comparison to the perimenopause, they are pretty low level fluctuations. So we see much bigger fluctuations when you get to perimenopause. So if we think about this and we think, well, okay, during normal fluctuations associated with menstruation, the monthly, what typically monthly that we have, in a period of low estrogen, what we see is that medication aimed at regulating dopamine becomes less effective because the estrogen is affecting dopamine levels. So it's a bit like the difference between a sort of ripple in the ocean with a little wave coming out from it and a tidal wave. And the
Mhm.
perimenopause is much more like a tidal wave. So what happens is you see greater fluctuations in estrogen. So when it was low before and that impacted dopamine, or where it was low before, now it's really low. So it's gone from being low to being a drought. And eventually it becomes settles at very, very low levels post menopause. And when that happens, that's impacting all of your dopamine signaling. And dopamine signaling, of course, dopamine is one of many neurotransmitters. And the vast majority of dopaminergic neurons are found in a tiny area in the middle of the brain, or two tiny areas that sort of sit very close together. But they actually send signals to a huge range of areas. So we have a pathway called the mesocortical pathway, which means it goes from the middle of the brain to the cortex. That's
Mhm.
critical for attention and to a degree working memory. So all of those kind of cognitive functions, executive functions that are impacted in ADHD and of course impacted during menopause. But it also goes another subset of that pathway is the mesolimbic, which goes again from the middle of the brain to the limbic system. And that's really important for our goal directed behavior. Whenever I'm describing goal directed behavior to my students, I say it's the behavior that means I always want cake. And I will, I will do almost anything for a slice of cake. I'll run 10 miles just so I can have a slice of cake. Um, but that pathway is a pathway that's absolutely critical in impulsivity, which of course is a core symptom of ADHD. And then again, we also have another dopaminergic pathway critical for motor functioning. And we can see how the symptoms of hyperactivity can arise during that, through that pathway. So when estrogen levels are really low, they are knocking out the regulation of dopamine or the typical regulation of dopamine. And then all of the symptoms that somebody with ADHD may experience can be heightened because of the lower levels of ADHD and of estrogen. And if you are taking medication that's normally effective, that medication will therefore feel less effective. Um,
Hmm.
it's important to understand that everything interacts with everything. So although we talk about dopamine, yes, dopamine is absolutely critical in ADHD, but it isn't just dopamine, because that has effects on other chemicals. It's also thought to be quite a central role for noradrenaline. And similarly, estrogen is the main fluctuating hormone, but of course, progesterone and testosterone are also important. So
Right.
it's a really fine balance, and finding that balance. And actually, when we talk about ADHD, for many years, people were saying, "Oh, it's too much dopamine here, or it's too little dopamine there." And actually, it's more nuanced than that. It's about having it perfectly balanced and perfectly regulated in different parts of the brain. So when you alter it in one place, it necessarily has a knock-on effect in others. But certainly, the normal ripples of your menstrual period in terms of estrogen levels suddenly turn into sort of tidal waves and eventually a complete drought of estrogen as your body then operates at very, very low levels. And that can lead to some people experiencing the symptoms that arise in perimenopause for years after their final, a year since their final period, which is what's deemed the actual menopause, is that year after your final period. But people can
Right.
experience, for example, hot flushes for years after that.
Wow. Hmm. That's a lot of information right there. But I get it. Like sometimes so I'm postmenopausal and, the symptoms I had before have kind of diminished and, but then there are certain other symptoms that are like really heightened and it makes perfect sense what you just said. Like I'm experiencing it. So I can tell you that oh boy, it's so real. So, given the limited research in this intersection, what are the most pressing questions you think need answering to help women and clinicians better understand and better distinguish and manage overlapping symptoms of ADHD and menopause?
So I think there's some fundamental scientific questions that it would be great to answer. So to really be able to map out how estrogen impacts dopamine and noradrenaline and other neurochemicals during the period of menopause transition in comparison to those that came before. It'd be great to have a really strong understanding of that. And that information would be useful. But actually, I think for the people we're actually trying to do this research to help, they probably have other questions that are more
Right.
pressing to them. Yes, I'm sure they'd love to know what their dopamine's doing, but they might feel better if they could just understand why they felt a particular way. And I think the kind of questions that now need to be answered are about understanding the diversity of menopause transition. So, we know just, right as women, we know right from the teenage years, in your friendship circle, you'll have someone that barely even notices a period pain and somebody else that is sort of bent over double in pain. You'll have women with very different experiences of hormonal contraceptives, of pregnancy and breastfeeding, all things associated with big changes in hormones. And yet, I think probably because of the taboo nature of the menopause, and because society sort of sees the menopause as the point where women are no longer useful for the function that they have, evolution gave them, we don't really talk about the menopause so much. So I think we need to answer questions about the diversity of experience. And in our case, we're focusing on how the experience may vary if you have ADHD. But there are
Mm-hmm.
lots of other factors that could affect this. We know, for example, that women of certain ethnic groups are more likely to experience problematic night flushes, night sweats and hot flushes than women of other groups. And yet, what do we do with that information? Well, as far as I can tell, we don't do anything. Now, you could say, well,
Right.
if a woman has a problem, they should go to their GP, and they do. But, if we're able to actually kind of normalize some of these experiences, because they are the very definition of normal, every woman will go through this. So it is the definition of normal to go through the menopause. Um, so if we could look at the diversity, normalize some of those different experiences or the range of experiences. So I think the questions we actually need to answer are the questions that matter to the women.
Right.
And that's part of what we're doing in the next phase of our research. And I think I'm sort of preempting there, but I think one of the big questions they'll want to know is, does that mean medication for ADHD can help me with menopause? And does it mean
Mm.
HRT can help me with my ADHD? And I think clinicians probably also need guidance on how to help a woman who has ADHD manage their menopausal experiences. And if that needs to be different from a woman that doesn't have ADHD, every woman is unique anyway in their experiences. But at the moment, there is no indication about differentially treating if a woman is
Right.
menopausal. As an example, there is emerging literature suggesting that clinicians should modulate the dose of ADHD medication immediately before a period, but there's nothing for if a woman is perimenopausal. So,
Mm.
that to me is a really important question for clinicians. The menopause transition can last for up to 15 years. That's a significant proportion of our lifetime. And I don't see why anyone would want that experience for that duration to be unpleasant when there are ways to make it less pleasant. I don't think we can make it, enjoyable, but I think we can make it less pleasant. So I think there are questions about understanding what women want to know, talking to clinicians, certainly in the UK, and this does vary around Europe and I'm sure in other places. Medical school training around the menopause is very minimal. So
It is.
a lot of GPs, a lot of hospital physicians, they won't have a huge amount of knowledge of the menopause. Add into that ADHD, and they're understandably working a little bit blind. So I think it's having those conversations, getting clinicians and women involved with the research, not just as participants, but also helping us design the research to answer the questions that need to be answered. But I think the treatment one is a very interesting one. Historically, we have things that work for menopause or some of the symptoms. We have things that work for ADHD. What happens if we bring those together? That would be really interesting.
That definitely would be very interesting because, again, coming from somebody who is postmenopausal and the stuff that I've had to go through, I do not have ADHD, but again, at times I was wondering, like, do I have ADHD? Like, why am I, because there were certain overlapping symptoms, or the symptoms that I was having were very much related to ADHD. And then absolutely the GPs have very minimal knowledge. And the first thing they jump to is, oh, let's put you on HRT. Or, it's not like, let's try and diagnose if maybe you have adult ADHD. So that part is missing, I would say, and it's a huge part that's missing. It's a very important part that's missing, absolutely. And it's I wish there were more who would step up and study this and research this.
And I
Okay.
think it goes both ways as well, actually, because
Yeah,
until you either, I come from a background of researching ADHD, not the menopause. And, it, you know, I think I had no idea of the extent of menopause transition experiences. I knew about hot flushes and night sweats. I don't think I knew about physical aches and pains. I don't think I knew about sleep disruption, and psychosocial difficulties and depression and anxiety mounting, and
Mhm.
even to the point of having suicidal thoughts. That never occurred to me that that could be part of menopause. So I think we do have this difficulty where clinicians looking at at a woman and deciding they're perimenopausal and give them some HRT probably don't know that much about ADHD, but also the people looking at somebody to assess them for ADHD probably don't know that much about the extent of the menopause as well. So it's almost like you've got to bring these two lots of experts together. Um, I don't know how you do that. I think it will happen naturally over time. But yeah, I think there's a lack of knowledge of the diversity of experience on both sides for everyone.
I absolutely agree. And if you could leave our listeners with one message about navigating this stage of life with self compassion, clarity, confidence, what would it be?
I think it would be that despite the taboo in society about menopause and about women reaching an age where they can no longer have children, this is actually perfectly normal. I can say that not quite on the other side of it. So, I mean, maybe ask me again in 2 years and I'd say something else. But I think it is about recognizing that despite what society says, this is
Right,
a normal stage in life, but also talk about it. As I said, I mean, I'm 45 and I only started doing this research 2 years ago, and I honestly had no idea what I am heading towards. And actually,
right.
now I know what I'm heading towards. I'm a little bit concerned, but I know what I'm heading towards. So I think I would say, recognize this as all normal. It's all typical. Manage it how you wish. For some women, that is HRT. For other women, it is not. And I think that's okay. Manage it how you wish, but talk about it. Tell
Absolutely.
your friends, have that, because it's, I mean, I'm not going to say the cliche of a problem shared is a problem halved. I don't think it goes away, but actually it
Right.
is very much a shared experience of all women at some point in their lives, and yet somehow we're trained not to talk about it. And I don't know why, because I think the more we talk about it, the more women's voices are heard, the more the right research will be done as well, which is really important.
Absolutely. And I think the more you share, the more it kind of becomes a little less scary. And
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
comforting to know that, hey, someone else is also going through it. So it's not that bad. And at the same time, it's basically when you share your thoughts, and it's like educating each other too. Sometimes people might not know what they're really going through. They always, name it something else.
Mm,
So I know that somebody who was having hot flashes, she thought she was going through anxiety. It turned out to be hot flashes. And just speaking about it, discussing it with family, with friends, with other women in the similar situation definitely raises a lot more, I would say, knowledge and out there, like you said. But thank you so very much. I am so happy we had this conversation. And thank you so much for joining me and sharing your expertise with us. It truly, truly was an insightful discussion. Thank you again, Dr. Dommett.
thank you for having me.
And that's a wrap on this episode of The Fog and the Fury. If your brain's buzzing or just a little foggy, that's perfectly normal. We're only scratching the surface of how ADHD and a menopause connect. If you found this episode helpful, hit subscribe, share it with a friend, or leave a quick review. It really helps others find the show. And, if you've got any questions or any aha moments, please do share in the comments or email us at thefogandthefury@gmail.com. I'm going to leave it in the comment below. But do reach out to us with any questions, any concerns, any aha moments. Would love to hear from you. Appreciate you all. Have a good day.